back on the show for our second segment. So, gentlemen, thanks for sticking around for another segment. Let's talk a little bit about some of the top issues that you both have addressed on your respective websites. Drugs and violent crime and gangs, I guess, as well. Dave, we'll start with you this time. Talk a little bit about that issue and how you might tackle it as the leader of the Stearns County Sheriff's Office, drugs, violent crime.
The meth, I believe, still continues to be probably the number one drug problem out there. I think that in Way Park we've partnered with the other cities, small cities, to have a person on the violent offender task force. There's a lot of drugs flowing through the county, and to continue to work with VOTIF to be a part of that. Do what we can to try to expand their abilities to work out in the rural areas, because that's one of the things that I've heard a lot in my travels is the concern that people have for the drug flow and the access that our youth seem to have to illicit drugs. And so we need to be out in the rural areas trying to combat that issue.
Steve, talk a little bit about that, too. Obviously, it's something that you know a lot about. Talk a little bit about how you would maybe increase enforcement of violent crimes and drugs in our county.
So as the commander of the Central Minnesota Violent Offender Task Force the past few years, I obviously do know about the drug scene firsthand. Meth is probably our biggest drug out in the whole county. Heroin and opioids are definitely a problem, more so in the metropolitan area of St. Cloud. We don't see as much out west, not to say it's not out there. I would definitely, as the sheriff, continue our involvement in the Violent Offender Task Force. It's a very good group of a collaborative effort of law enforcement agencies that are trying to tackle the problem. I also would like to see a little more work maybe done on our west end. As the commander, I would attempt to push our people out west, but the reality is St. Cloud metropolitan area is kind of a target-rich area, and a lot of our business, unfortunately, brought the investigators back into St. Cloud area to do the enforcement stuff, to do the search warrants. But there's definitely stuff out west that needs to be worked on, and just if we can get somebody maybe out there dedicated to the west end drug enforcement stuff, they can build some more rapport with the small towns to receive information a little bit more from the agencies out there and work closely with those law enforcement agencies and enforcement stuff. I would also like to there's a very successful that our drug task force members are part of up in the Morrison County area, prescription drug task force that specifically deals with the medical facilities, pharmacies. It's a collaborative effort of doctors and the law enforcement and other medical professionals. Bring that to St. Cloud. There's no sense to reinvent the wheel. If we can bring a model like that to St. Cloud, obviously there's more health facilities here that would need to partner up with us, but I think it's something that we could certainly try to bring here to tackle the opioid crisis.
How do you guys think we're doing, Stearns County as a whole is doing, when it comes to this issue of illegal drugs compared to other counties? Are we all kind of in the same boat here on this one? Are we doing maybe a little bit better, maybe not as well? What do you think?
I think having had a briefing from Janelle Kendall in the county attorney's office, they're seeing a lot of drug cases, again, mostly meth cases. In Way Park, we haven't seen a big increase in drug seizing large quantities of drugs or anything. We've had a few warrants served out there, but we're not seeing a lot of it right now in Way Park.
Mm-hmm. How about you? Compare us to other counties. Like, are we pretty much on par with other counties in central Minnesota, or we have a higher rate, or what do you think?
I'd have to say we're probably on par. We are so close to the metro area. We are kind of a regional distribution center, if you would. The drugs will come into Minnesota, sometimes not through the traditional ways that you think, and they end up in St. Cloud, where they're then distributed to Wilmer and to Alexandria and to Brainerd. But sometimes it works the other direction too. But we do have a drug problem. Just about every kind of drug you can think of it can be found in Stearns County for the most part. I think it's important to keep up our work on that from an enforcement standpoint to kind of deter some of that criminal activity. So.
In the WJON newsroom, of course, we write a lot of crime stories, and every time we post them on our Facebook page, we get a lot of comments. I think there's a perception out there that crime is way up. Like crime is way worse now than it was, back when we were all kids, that sort of a thing. Is that true, or is it just being reported more now? Dave, what do you think? Is crime way off the charts compared to what it was, back in the day, back in the 70s, 80s, whatever?
And I've spent a fair amount of time analyzing crime rates and crime stats, not only in my city, but countywide. And, when you look at it from a time perspective, most of our agencies are experiencing higher call volumes, but the Part 1 crimes, which tend to be the more serious crimes, are actually relatively flat if you look over a 10 to 20 year period of time. And so I do think there is more being reported and covered through media. But again, when I look at the numbers, there's obviously been population growth in the area, but the Part 1 crimes, like I said, the more serious, you don't see big spikes, and so I think that's a benefit or a recognition of our law enforcement officers and the quality of work they do to maintain and investigate those cases.
Yeah, and Steve, obviously you've been working in the sheriff's office for a while. I mean, you have a sense over there. Do you feel like crime is jumping or maintaining, or what do you think?
Well, I don't think, and I think stats kind of prove that nationwide that crime is actually kind of decreasing, but it does give the perception that it is. And I do think one thing that factors into that is just the media, social media. It's much easier to report things, and there's a larger venue for people to look stuff up and see stuff compared to the old days. So it might look like there's more crime. The reality is I don't know that there's an increase in crime necessarily in Stearns County, but I will tell you as a sheriff's office employee, from when I started here to now, there's definitely an increase in calls for service. And that might be more not criminal type things, but more behavioral science or behavioral mental type calls that we go to. Just your general service calls that aren't really criminal matters, but they need law enforcement to kind of resolve it. So there's definitely an increase in that, probably twofold from what I remember from back in the day. So
let's talk about human trafficking, because I think that all goes probably hand in hand with drugs and all of that, which we now know. We probably didn't know this 5 years ago, but certainly we now know that there's a huge sex trafficking problem in central Minnesota. So Steve, talk a little bit about that. How would you address that issue? It's such a painful issue for a lot of people.
Yeah, so there's definitely a sex trafficking issue in central Minnesota. It is something that's probably been here for quite some time. It just it took a while for people to take notice of it, maybe, from an enforcement standpoint, I can honestly say I've been there and done that, because for one summer we were tasked at the Violent Offender Task Force to do enforcement stuff. We actually partnered up with Waite Park with their investigator who does an excellent job investigating those crimes. We assigned an investigator from the Violent Offender Task Force, and I kind of supervised the little group that was there going out and doing operations. I would have to say that for sure any community could have it occurring. Certainly it's more pronounced in, again, these target rich areas like St. Cloud, Waite Park, Sartell, the central Minnesota area, because it's just there's more population here. But you could have it anywhere, honestly, that you have hotels. For sure you could have it. But it it's definitely a problem that's here. It's one of what I feel is one of many problems that are occurring as far as a criminal matter in Stearns County. So.
Yeah. Dave, I know this is something you've worked on for several years now. Are you making a difference? Are you making headway?
I believe that we are. When we started this thing, and it was back in about 2010 where we had our first real exposure to it. It was a 14-year-old girl that was being trafficked out of a motel room, and she was out of the metro. And to see where we've come since then, we once we recognized that we had a real problem, we started working the problem with a local investigator group from a variety of jurisdictions, really working more or less part-time. Investigators had other cases, but, we made a series of arrests on sex buyers. We were able to get convictions on 7 or 8 individuals for rather lengthy prison sentences. There was definitely a correlation between violent offenders and drugs when it came to the sex trafficking issue. And to see where we've come now with the help of a state grant, we have a full-time investigative task force, 2 investigators full-time working trafficking cases, and we have a very strong multidisciplinary collaboration going on, focused on the issue. We've got a safe house in Waite Park for victims of sex trafficking. And so we've come a long way, and I believe we are making a difference.
All right. We have just a couple minutes left, but before we wrap up, Steve, you mentioned mental health issues. And I would imagine when law enforcement officials, whether it's police officers or deputies, get called out, a high percentage of the calls they go to have something to do with mental health issues. If you're the sheriff, would you do something differently? Would you change the way things are done so that maybe you can respond to these folks in a different way to have a better outcome? Because it is such a touchy issue when you get out there and somebody's dealing with mental health issues.
So the state of Minnesota is mandating that we go through critical incident training already, and we're about probably a quarter of the way sending our officers through it. It's got to do it in kind of waves. I would continue with that. I would continue with ongoing mental health training. It's very important for us at the street level, responding officers, to identify, is this a drug or alcohol problem, or is this a mental health issue, and how to respond to it. And I would also extend that into our jail facility. We have several people, I believe, in our jail facility that probably, for all intents and purposes, probably don't actually belong there because of just mental health issues. And I have our jail staff receive the same type of training on how to respond to those people, how to identify this as more of a mental health issue. Sometimes they're very obvious, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they can come in and things can change while they're in the jail setting, just like they can out on the street. So definitely training is a big key to that. And I think there's different disciplines also that you can deal with that. Military PTSD compared to regular PTSD, dealing with the vets and some of their mental health issues can be different than dealing with somebody who's just having not taking their meds or something correctly. So definitely training would be where I would head.
Yeah, Dave.
I've been involved in many meetings now the last couple of years, multidisciplinary in nature, centric care, mental health center. And we sat down with St. Cloud last year, and we started looking at some of our regular contacts with individuals. And, Waite Park, we'd have 2 or 3 contacts in a 90-day period. St. Cloud might have 7 or 8 with the same person. So an individual having 10-plus contacts with law enforcement, mental health related, and it just kind of gets this revolving door feeling between whether that's detox or so when we're having contact with individuals that are, I kind of say, pre-crisis, if there's some things that we can do to make better referrals and get that person the help that they need, and as opposed to allowing things just to continue to escalate where they maybe commit a crime and they wind up in jail. I believe a lot of people are in jail that their main issue is mental health. And if we can figure out some better referral systems for those folks, because incarceration is expensive, and I think there are cheaper ways and more effective ways to help folks.
All right. We're out of time, you guys. Thank you for coming in. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
The 2 men running for Stearns County Sheriff, again, Dave Bentrud and Steve Soyka, have been our guests here on the Candidate Forum here today on WJON.